There were two men against him that day, and only one of them was dangerous, and it was not the giant. The giant was simply the largest human being any of them had ever stood next to. The dangerous one was the man in the dark shirt at the edge of the lights, who never touched anybody, who only pointed and said, "Hold him." It was a working film, set in the early 1970s. A converted warehouse the size of an airplane hangar, with a ceiling, lost in shadow, and 40 feet of scaffolding, and lights along one wall. Cables ran across the concrete in taped bundles. A camera sat on a dolly track that went nowhere at the moment, because they were between setups. And 40 crew members stood around in the particular boredom of people who are paid to wait. Grips, electricians, a couple of stunt performers in dusty denim, a script supervisor with a clipboard she was not looking at. 3 men on that floor did not belong to the waiting. The first was a consultant, brought in on the fight sequences, a lean, hard man in a dark shirt with his hair pulled back, who had spent the better part of a week explaining things to people who had not asked. He had explained to the stunt coordinator that tournaments were games. He had explained to the director that belts were jewelry. He had explained at lunch to anyone slow enough to still be sitting there that everything this business called martial arts was choreography, and that none of it survived a real man putting real hands on you, and that he was the only person on the payroll who had ever been the real man. The second was the reason the studio had rented an extra-wide doorway. He was a professional wrestler, and he was close to 7 feet tall, and he was built on a scale that photographs could not hold. He had been hired for a single sequence because there is no special effect in the world as convincing as a genuinely enormous man. And he was, by every account of everyone who worked with him that week, one of the gentlest people any of them had ever met. He carried the craft service girl's tray for her. He learned the grips' names. He had never once in his life had to raise his voice, because the size did all the talking he ever needed done. The third was a small man in a white t-shirt and black trousers who had said almost nothing all week and had watched everything. If you want to understand why the smallest man on that stage was the one the giant ended up looking to, stay with this, because the giant figured out what was happening in that room a long time before the man giving the orders did. It started, as these things do, over nothing. They were resetting a shot. The small man had offered a quiet note on the choreography, a change to where a block landed, because the way they had it, a hand ended up somewhere that would read wrong on camera. It was a craft observation. It was correct. And the consultant, who had been looking for 4 days for exactly this kind of opening, laughed out loud so the back of the stage could hear him, and said that this was the whole problem with these people, that they cared how a thing looked instead of whether it worked, and that the small man in the t-shirt had clearly never had a real man's hands on him in his life. The small man said, mildly, that this was probably a conversation for another time. That was the wrong answer to give a man who needs a scene, because a man who declines to escalate has stolen your ending, and the consultant wanted his ending badly enough now to reach for someone else to provide it. He turned, and he looked up a long way up at the giant who had been standing at the edge of the lights minding his own enormous business, and he pointed at the small man and said, "You, hold him. Just hold him still. Let's see how much the technique is worth when he can't move." The stage went quiet, because this was a different thing than a man mouthing off. This was a man ordering 300 and some pounds of another human being to lay hands on someone, and the giant did not move right away, and everyone saw that he did not. Here is the first thing worth staying for, because the giant's hesitation told you everything about him. He looked at the consultant, and then he looked at the small man, and there was a question on his face. Not fear. The man had never been afraid of anything physical in his life, but a kind of reluctance. The reluctance of a genuinely gentle person being told to do something to someone who had not done anything to him. And the small man saw it, and did the thing that decided the whole afternoon. He looked up at the giant, and gave him the smallest nod. "It's all right," the nod said. "Go ahead. You are not the problem here." So the giant, given permission by the one person in the room who had the standing to give it, stepped forward and reached out one enormous hand and took a fistful of the small man's t-shirt at the shoulder and closed it. and the cotton and the man inside it disappeared into a grip that could have palmed a basketball like an orange. And the small man raised one finger, not to the giant. He held it up between them, plain, at the height of his own face, the way you hold up a number, and he said quietly, so that only the front of the crowd caught it, "You can hold me for as long as you are comfortable, but I am going to tell you something first, because you did not ask for this." And he did. He tipped his head very slightly toward the consultant. "When I decide to leave your hand, you will not be able to keep me, and it will not be because you are not strong. You are the strongest man I have ever stood in front of. It will be because a grip needs a thing to hold, and I am going to stop being a thing to hold. I would rather you heard it from me than found it out with everyone watching." The giant looked down at him, and something in the giant's face changed, because it is a strange experience to have a man you are physically dominating speak to you gently, as a courtesy, about your own grip. It is not how that moment is supposed to go. Then the small man left the hand. Nobody in that building could describe afterward exactly how, and that includes the giant, who had the best view. The small man did not wrench backward, which is what a held man does, and what the enormous hand was braced for. He dropped his weight, sinking straight down as he turned his shoulder under the grip, so that the shirt that had been pulled taut across a solid frame suddenly had nothing solid behind it, just fabric folding around a shoulder that was rotating out from inside it. The giant's fist, which had been holding a man, was abruptly holding a handful of loose cotton and air, and the small man was standing a quarter turn away, out of the line of the grip entirely, his own hands still down at his sides. He had not struck, he had not pried at the fingers, he had simply, in about half a second, stopped being where the hand was. The count never got anywhere. That was what the crew talked about. The small man had offered him time, as long as you are comfortable, and the giant never used it, because the instant the shirt went slack in his hand, he understood, faster than anyone else on that stage, precisely what he had just been shown. He did not grab again. A lesser man, an angry man, would have grabbed again and gotten the same result twice in front of 40 people. The giant was not a lesser man. He opened his hand the rest of the way, deliberately, and he looked down at the small man, and he stepped back half a pace and gave him room. And then the giant did the thing that made the man in the dark shirt very alone. He turned to the consultant, the one who had given the order, who was still standing there with his argument half finished on his face, and the giant shook his head. Once, slow, it was not a dramatic gesture. From a man that size, it did not need to be. It said, "No, I am not doing that again, and you should not have asked me to do it the first time, and I think you knew what would happen and sent me to find out for you." He said something out loud too, quiet enough that only the nearest few heard it, and the two grips who did hear it told it the same way for years. He said, "You hold him." The consultant did not hold him. Of course he did not. There was no version of the next 30 seconds that worked for him, and he could feel the whole stage arriving at that understanding at the same time he did. If he stepped forward, he was a man who had just watched a 7-foot professional decline the thing he was now going to try. If he stood there, he was a man whose muscle had quietly refused him in front of 40 witnesses and walked to the other side. He had spent a week building a case that size and force were the only real things in the world, and the largest, most forceful thing in the room had just looked at him and stepped away. The small man reached up and settled his own collar with 2 fingers. Unhurried. He was not breathing hard. He looked at the consultant, and he was not unkind about it, which somehow made it worse. He said only, "He understood it faster than you did. That should tell you something." Then he turned to the giant, and here is the last thing worth staying for, because it is the part nobody expects. He did not gloat, and he did not thank him for stopping. He looked up at the enormous man, and he said, "You have the best base I have ever felt on a person. Do you know that? Most big men are top-heavy. You are not. If you ever want to learn what to do with it, come find me. I am here another 2 weeks. And the giant, who had spent his whole working life being hired for his size and admired for his size, and never once, that anyone knew of, offered instruction in what to do with it, looked at the small man for a moment, and then broke into an enormous, delighted, entirely genuine smile, and put out a hand the size of a dinner plate, and the small man shook it, and it vanished, and the two of them stood there for a second grinning at each other, like the only two people in on a joke. The stage went back to work. It always does. The first assistant called the reset, and the grips moved the light, and 40 people picked up the conversations they had been having 90 seconds earlier. Near the end of the day, the director found the stunt coordinator and said without any drama that they would not be needing the consultant past this week. Nobody was fired in front of anybody. It simply did not get renewed. And in the corridor behind the stage, in a moment only a couple of people saw, the consultant passed the small man one last time and stopped and seemed to want to say something, and the small man waited for it without any hostility at all. What the consultant finally said was, "He would have crushed you if you'd let him," and the small man said, "Yes, that's why I didn't let him, and that is the whole art." Then he went back to his water and his book. The giant told the story for the rest of his life, and he told it happily, because in his telling, he was not the one who got beaten, he was the one who got let in on something. He would hold up one finger, the way he had seen it done, and he would say, "He told me exactly what was going to happen before he did it." Who does that? Who warns you? And then he would laugh that enormous laugh and say the part he liked best, which was never about the shirt or the grip. It was, and then he told me I had a good base. Nobody had ever told me I had a good base. Everybody just told me I was big. Years later, the crew would argue about the details, the way they always do, how the shirt came loose, whether the giant ever really squeezed, what was said in the corridor, but they agreed on the shape of it. 2 men came at the small man that afternoon, and the strong one figured out in half a second what the smart one could not admit in a week, that there is a difference between being the biggest thing in the room and being right, and that the small man in the white t-shirt had never once confused the two.